So what is your memory of the Indianapolis 500? The whole world has its eye focused on Indianapolis for that Memorial Day race each year. And as I've driven through there, I know that big parts of the town are focused, as they should be, on this internationally famous race. What's your memory of the Indianapolis 500?
Several. One is I invited all the mayors of the world to come to Indianapolis one time for an international conference on cities. And a lot came and some stayed for the race. So we were all seated on the stretch there where the cars come in. And one car came in too fast and came right over and hit down the poles that held together the press situation. Photographers kept tumbling out, and just a fiasco, all for the world to see. These folks. Another time we were in a period in which the streaking was very popular. And this didn't happen during the race itself, but during the qualifications. We had several incidents in which persons, having dispensed with all of their clothes, sprinted down the straightaway, chased by police who were not contenders. They weren't fast enough to catch these. So on race day, our family always sat in a particular box reserved for the mayor, and we were overlooking a stretch, and it looked to me like there were a number of suspicious people that, given any opportunity, and the police had the same idea. But fortunately, the race went on and on and on. People didn't want to get in the middle of the track, in the middle of as soon as it was over, these people all headed for the track, and the police headed right after them, and there was no contest.
The two races on one day.
Yes.
And so the time came when it was time for you to move on up to the United States Senate. And how did that invitation, how was that presented?
Well, the first invitation came during 1974. This, as you recall, was a very difficult year for President Richard Nixon, to say the least, and a very difficult year for Indiana Republicans, as they took polls as to who would run against Senator Birch Bayh. Everyone did very badly. I did the least badly. I was only 8 points behind in the initial poll, and so they said, well, you have to run. We know you want to wait around for a better contest, and you are still mayor, but at the same time, you've got to do it for the party and for the country and whatever. So in any event, I did so. Things got worse. By the time summertime came and the fairs, I was down 16 points. And I thought, oh, this is a disaster. But then President Nixon resigned, as you recall. Mm-hmm. So he went through a period in August, and suddenly the polls came up to even. I said, this is miraculous. This is going to happen after all, even though no one ever anticipated. Not so. President Ford pardoned President Nixon, down 13 points. We finally lost by 4, but the experience was such that I gained statewide recognition, and people had a good impression. So the next race against Senator Vance Harkey, who had served 3 terms, was a fairly easy race.
That would have been 76.
Yes.
I see.
And a much more pleasant time.
Yeah. So one of the things that I noted on the floor when we talked about your service here was your involvement in so many important issues relative to world peace. And I made a note of the fact that you invited a brand new senator from Illinois named Barack Obama on a congressional trip to take a look at the nuclear proliferation issue firsthand. And it had a profound impact on him. He talked about it as soon as he returned and for many years after. What do you remember about that trip?
Well, I remember that Senator Obama really was a very faithful member of the Foreign Relations Committee. He was the last Democrat, and when we went back and forth with our question and answer, it was often 2 hours or so before we got to the senator. Sometimes we were the only 2 left at this point. And so I was really pleased when he asked, when the summertime came, he said, Dick, I know you go to Russia every year, and I'd like to go along with you this year. So I said, well, that'll be great. So in any event, after a short stay in Moscow, after all it was August and all the authorities were gone, we did see some labs with some rather dire chemicals in them and so forth. We went out to a place in mid-Russia, and there we took a look at how we disassembled some missiles that had been on trains and all that sort of thing. But same time, the people there were so pleased. They said, let's come back to the airport and celebrate. And they laid out caviar and vodka. And after an hour of this, I felt we had celebrated perhaps sufficiently. But we found we were not going to go anywhere, that we were going to be held at this airport for reasons we could not imagine. But later I learned that Russians felt that I was a spy, and that, as a matter of fact, they wanted to examine the planes. These young enlisted personnel that are on the planes, the guard them, were resisting that, unfortunately. And so we were going nowhere. Sunday afternoon, staff had cell phones. They couldn't get anybody at the State Department, Defense Department, any place. But Barack was very calm about it. I said, "This is cool, take a nap. This could last for a while, you know." But what a tough initiation for your first trip to Russia. But
well, you took him to Russia, and it's something he didn't forget. And it was on an issue which really you and Sam Nunn, the former senator from Georgia, have made a name for yourselves that will go down in history, because as the Soviet Union declined, the question remained, what would happen to those thousands of nuclear warheads in this unstable political situation in Russia, as well as this unstable economy? Would they maintain them? What was the threat to the world? And I think you and Sam Nunn stepped up in a way that will be recognized in history as having saved us from some possible calamities. As you look back, is that your proudest accomplishment in the Senate?
Yes, it is, because it's such an extraordinary, historically counterintuitive situation. Already President Gorbachev and President Reagan had talked about ridding the world of nuclear weapons, but not come to agreement at Reykjavik or other times of that variety. Some of the Russians that Sam and I had met when we went to Geneva, Switzerland, at the behest of President Reagan, to get ready for a treaty. You know, the 2/3 vote in the Senate and have a bipartisan group. In any event, some of these Russians came. I can remember vividly sitting around a round table in Sam's office, which I had wheeled down to my office after he left for historical purposes. They said, "We're bankrupt, and we've got officers that are deserting. And as a matter of fact, you folks spent trillions of dollars trying to contain this all this time. But at this point, we're both going to lose it, because it will not be sufficient security. So we need your money, we need your personnel that are technical, and we may need your troops, for that matter. But you've got to act, and act fast." I thought that a superpower like Russia, two countries talking about mutually assured destruction for 40 years without really realizing what that would mean, suddenly one of them comes and says, "We need your money, and we need it fast." So that was the beginning of the Nunn-Lugar Act. And things then moved in our country. There was always skepticism about this. On the Senate debate at that time, not surprisingly to you, having watched these things, some folks said, "We didn't want to spend a dime on the Russians. Let them go bankrupt. Let the worst happen." They said, "Well, hang on here. You know, we have an opportunity to work with them, cooperative threat reduction, to take down these missiles, to take off the warheads, to get the nerve gas under control." And they said, "Well, that's their problem. Let them pay for it. We've got problems."
I can hear the speeches.
And there were years when the appropriation bill, and I had to attend to this after Sam left every year, some were stymied by about 15 different amendments that said they've got to do this, 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 and this before we spend a dime. We went through one whole year one time without being able to spend a dime because of objections on the Senate floor. So it was never a lay down hand.
No.
And even to this day, there are many people who are not really in favor of arms control treaties. But I would just simply say this, I believe, was historically tremendously important for our security.
It was. Dick, when you gave your farewell speech on the floor of the Senate, you talked about bipartisanship, and you reflected on 6 terms in the Senate at the time that you'd spent here and the impact that it had. Reflecting back on those years, pick out a couple of your colleagues that are the most memorable in a positive sense that you could talk about for a moment.
Well, of course, Sam Nunn, my partner, still, after 20 years, still active, even though he's not on the Senate floor. But I've had really a wonderful association with Joe Biden, as we went back and forth in chairmanships or ranking members, and with John Kerry, likewise. I enjoyed so much Chuck Hagel when he was sort of the next ranking Republican. We saw a lot of each other, and it was very, very helpful. And we've had a good relationship with Bob Corker, who's sort of number 2 on the Republican side presently. But I mentioned those just because they sort of leap out. I've had some good ties with Ben Cardin, on amendments that we've created on various bills, because he's very familiar with Europe, very much in favor of transparency around the world. Had a great relationship with Pat Leahy in agriculture. Our portraits are hanging there at the back of the agriculture hearing room, and hopefully will not be taken down for a while.
I'm sure they won't. So as you've traveled around the world, you've met a lot of world leaders. Do any of those leap forward in your memory as particularly unusual or memorable?
Well, a good number unusual, but I will not be critical of their situations as they try to mind their own countries. I would just say that I've always been impressed with the people that we've had on our side. For instance, Secretary of State George Shultz was someone who was a great mentor for me, and he was helpful in guiding me to understand these leaders that I was going to seek, or back in the Reagan days and even subsequently. I've had wonderful relationships with many of the Russians. They're not good friends. They are people who come from a very different background altogether, but there is a mutual respect, feeling that somehow we've managed to live on the planet together. A very gracious times with many German friends. I have a German heritage with the Lugar family, having come from Germany. So I've always been interested in them, and maybe more cordial with their leadership.
What's next? Now, when you leave the Senate, what are you going to be doing next?
Well, probably a lot of things, but initially I have agreements with Indiana University and the University of Indianapolis and Georgetown University to spend several days on campus, on each of those campuses, give some speeches, to try to work with interns or students who come to Washington as they try to find possibilities. Then I'm going to work with the German Marshall Fund. And I look forward to that, because this will keep us in contact with diplomats, with ways in which they deal with each other as well as with our country. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, we have more ambitions that we'll have to see whether they work out. I would like to continue to work on what I call the Feeding the World projects, but they really come from agricultural heritage, from my background in the Agriculture Committee. I see lots of possibilities. Visit with Bill Gates and others who are doing great things all the way out in the field.
Dick, it's been an honor serving with you in the Senate. I wish you the very best.
Thank you, Dick. I appreciate you very much.
Thank you. Dick Lugar is going on to great things, I'm sure. This is not the end of his service to our country, and I wish him and Shar the very best, whatever their next undertaking may be. As you receive praise from the senator from Kentucky to the south of Indiana, accept some from the senator from west of Indiana in the state of Illinois. I'm honored to count Dick Lugar as a friend, and I'm sure going to miss you. You were an extraordinary ally and colleague in so many important issues.